So a little bit about me. Background is actually in local authorities and in planning law. But after a number of years, I did some postdoctoral research on digital planning. It seemed to be the most exciting thing that was happening to planning, in particular, how emerging technologies disrupt the existing regulatory landscape. And I'm now working at Pinsent Masons as a strategic advisor in planning, but also digital planning, which brings me into the data world. And I'm currently also a research fellow at the ODI, specialising now in digital ethics, working directly with Jenny Tennyson on that, and due to publish my main report in September this year. So very much in write-up mode at the moment. Next slide, please. So ethics, a lot to cover in quite a short time. And I think this is a really good working definition for data ethics, which is from the ODI. And they describe it as a branch of ethics that evaluates data practices with the potential to adversely impact on people and society in data collection, sharing and use. And you can see there that they talk of it as something that relates to good practice about how data is collected, used and shared, especially when they directly impact on people. Really good working definition of what data ethics is. But the keen-eyed among you will have noticed that this is not a definition as such. It's an explanation of a concept. And that's absolutely brilliant if you want to say what digital ethics is in general. Not so good if you want to tie somebody down and say, are you being ethical or not ethical? So when you get into the law, it's a concept that's really difficult to define and enforce. And there's two issues there. Firstly, people are risk averse, and they say, "Oh, not sure whether I'm digitally ethical or not." And it has a chilling effect on innovation because people are too frightened to take a risk in case they're not seen as being ethical. On the other hand, the lack of a clear legal standard, if you like, means that you also risk that people instigate practices that are not ethically sound, knowing that there is no enforceable standard that they'll be held against. So that can be difficult. So it's something we do have to wrestle with as a data community. Next slide, please. So I like to think of ethics in terms of shoulds and musts. And the should is very much what we're familiar with in terms of ethics, the things you should do, up there with getting up early, going for a run, flossing, and eating well, and your 10,000 steps and all the rest of it, the things you know that you should be doing in ethics, in data. And I think this is consistent with the data kind message that you're responsible with data, and also the ODI mission to make better decisions about data. And it's very easy, I think, to do what you should do when you're working for a small organization and you're in the third sector, because you've got direct contact with a small number of people, oversight of all your practices. When it gets more difficult to be ethical is in two areas. Firstly, where you have commercial interests, because you might find that what you should do is not necessarily closely aligned with what makes the greatest commercial sense. So you have a bit of a tension there once things get beyond the third sector, beyond the small project. And again, you have this difficulty of saying what's ethical and what's not ethical. How do you prove that something's ethical or not? So this is where I think some of the musts come in. And this is where I'm going to talk for a little while about some of those ethical musts when it comes to the law. Next slide, please. So compliance. And then when I'm talking about compliance, I'm talking about something that somebody somewhere says should not just happen, but can be enforced if it doesn't happen. And I think although this isn't an immediate issue for the third sector, small organizations doing small scale projects, because we live in a data-driven world, because the value of what you do in the third sector is so important, eventually these projects are going to grow. They're going to become more pervasive. You're going to want to fund them. You may want a local authority to host them or support them, and this will bring you into an area of greater public scrutiny, especially when that's part of a local authority decision. I've worked in local authorities for nearly 30 years, and however good the proposal seemed to be, there would always be somebody who didn't like the idea and would be prepared to come up and object to it. And that's where having a robust ethical background and a robust ethical foundation, if you like, is a good thing. And that starts with knowing what the regulatory and policy landscape is. And as all of you know that are working with data, this starts with the Data Protection Act 2018 and the General Data Protection Regulation. And when it comes to data, people say it's the new oil. I think it's more like the new steam, in the sense that you've got this fantastic new source of energy that can power all sorts of social processes. But just as having the steam technology didn't necessarily mean you could go and run an efficient passenger service, so you need to build an infrastructure for ethics that works. And some of that difficult terrain is in the compliance area. We all know about GDPR, but if you're working for a local authority or trying to get local authority funding, or perhaps wanting to work with a company that's a public facing and wants to be seen to do the right thing, there are a couple of extra things you need to think about. The first of those is human rights. Article 8 is the obvious one, the right to privacy. Technically, no local authority should make any decision that affects people if it interferes with their freedom of expression and their freedom to have a quiet and private family life. And I mean, my background's in planning law, and this Article 8, along with a couple of others, have been asserted successfully a number of times. And I remember when the Human Rights Act came out and everybody said it won't affect planning. And hey presto, a few years down the line, it's still affecting the planning system. So being aware that when you're going to a local authority, they might think, are there human rights implications here, is a really good way to start looking at the harder edges of ethical compliance. And then there's something else called the Public Sector Equality Duty, which comes out of the Equalities Act 2010. And this means, again, when a public sector authority makes a decision that affects its population, it must have due regard to the impacts of that decision on people with protected characteristics. Now, the downside of that is you need to build a little bit of knowledge of what this duty is. And if you're perhaps bidding for a contract or making an application for funding, or actually asking a local authority to approve a project that you're working on in a public way, then be aware that this public sector equality duty is relevant to all of those decisions. Um, Certainly in planning terms, there was an application for a market with a lot of Latin American traders. Local authority didn't have enough regard to the implications of that decision on those Latin American traders. They challenged the grant of the planning permission for redevelopment, and the planning permission was overturned. So these kind of overarching ethical laws, if you like, have this capacity to lead to public sector decisions being overturned if they are challenged on that basis. And this is where I want to mention very briefly artificial intelligence, because it affects both human rights and some of the things protected by the public sector equality duty. The EU has just brought out the first ever draft law on AI, and they mention a number of different areas where it affects human rights. And I had a look, and it affects a number, actually. The right to a fair trial can be impacted by use of data and artificial intelligence. The right to private and family life, Article 8, is affected, but also the right of freedom of expression, Article 10, and then Article 14, prohibition of discrimination. They can all be impacted by AI if AI is used improperly. And obviously, data drives AI, and it's part of the data-driven solution. So it's really well worth aware of that. Similarly with AI, the public sector equality duty wants to make sure that there's no discrimination. Now, the police in South Wales were using, can you just, sorry, back up just a little bit, sorry. The police were using facial recognition technology in Wales last year, and this was challenged on the basis that they were using AI to analyse the issues and the faces, and it was successfully challenged because the police hadn't looked at their equalities implications well enough. This is only going to spread as biometrics become more used. It's relevant also to voice recognition software, because some technology, if it's not been trained well enough, might not recognize a strong accent. So these are all things that are the hard edges of digital compliance and data ethics that are really well worth building into your bids, to your funding applications, and to your decision making. Next slide, please. So beyond compliance, now stepping back a little bit from the law. Personally, I've been looking at digital ethics now for 6 months, and I thought every week that I think I've read everything there is to know about this, something new comes out. And I can only imagine how difficult it must be for a third sector organisation to have any kind of grasp of the overall national, local, or even international landscape when it comes to digital ethics. So here's my recommendation for 4 really good starting points. There is a national data ethics framework, and that is based on 3 principles: transparency, that decisions are open to inspection; accountability, that you have effective governance and oversight; and fairness, which is something I'm going to talk about in a little while, that you are able to eliminate the potential to have unintended consequences, which ties into this thing I've been talking about with ethics and bias. So the National Data Ethics Framework is probably the best place to start if you want to show that you're making a good ethical data related decision, and you want to demonstrate that you took the right guidance into account. So that's a really good starting point. The National Data Strategy isn't upfront about data ethics, but it does have a number of missions that it is based on. And one of those missions is trusted data regimes. And the word trust is coming into so many agendas nowadays, both in the public sector, but also increasingly as part of the ESG agenda within corporate entities. This is where the national data strategy is sort of tying in data and that need to have trust. The data strategy is still emerging at the moment, so it's a little bit light on detail, but it is worth, if you want to say we took into account the guidance, the relevant guidance, this is, I would say, your second place to go to say, look, we took X parts of the emerging data strategy into account. This is how we comply with that guidance. This is how we show that we are being ethical. I would obviously promote the ODI Data Ethics Canvas, and I think I've got that coming up on my next slide, so I'm going to talk about that in a little while. Card here, which is the 7 principles of public life. They are a wild card because they are pre-digital. They came out of a review of standards in public life in the 1990s. So I am Gen X, and it's a real Gen X thing, the 7 principles of public life. They also get referred to as the Nolan principles. And why I'm saying they're good to use is that if you're working perhaps in a local authority environment where they are a culture that is fairly new to digital innovation, it won't be a culture that's new to the 7 principles of public life. You can kind of meet them halfway if you start taking account when you're working with local authorities or any public sector organisation. People my age and older than me will know about them, will be familiar with them. It's a really good way to hang any bids or funding applications on. It's a really good sort of headings, and the headings are very familiar when it comes to ethics. The principle of acting selflessly, the principle of acting with integrity, objectivity, accountability, which is also in the data ethics framework, openness, well, transparency is across the board something that's seen as valuable, honesty, and leadership. Now, you don't have to be a data ethicist to know that many of these principles are currently being questioned for their application in national government. And for this reason and many others, the Committee on Standards in Public Life is currently reviewing these principles. So they are being updated. Hopefully they will take the digital revolution into account. The committee has actually done a really excellent report on the use of AI in local government. So if you want some starting points for demonstrating ethics beyond the mere law, this I think is a really good place to start. Next slide, please. So one starting point, this is now into the, okay, she's talked about all of these things. She's given me a bewildering set of laws I've never heard of. And then she's talked about all these digital ethical standards. But what do I actually need to do? What can I practically do today when I get back into the office? What's my key takeaway? I think the first place is to start with your own ethical principles, whether you take them from the ethics framework or the ODI or the Nolan principles, have them. And you probably already do have them as a mission statement for your charity. But if they aren't adapted for data and data ethics, now is the time. Obviously, engagement and education, there's so much out there. It's bewildering amount of stuff, but you can get yourself familiar with these things very quickly and for free. And in any case, ethics changes all the time, so it's a good idea to have a list of favored websites that you visit regularly. And then scoping, having a good sense of what your issues are is an excellent place to start. So next slide, please. And this is where I have a shameless plug for the ODI and its ethics canvas. It is one of a number of tools. So I'm not going to say it's the only way you can scope all your ethical issues, but I think it's one of the most complete. Obviously, it's trusted. The ODI is a national organization, and it gives you, again, another way of saying this is how we scoped our digital issues, our ethical issues, and this is what we did. And it's, it's bright, it's colorful, it's easily understood by people who are not digital ethicists or lawyers. Really good source of guidance and training if you have the resources for that. Next slide, please. Second practical point, fairness. What is it? And I just want to sort of dip my toe into this one. It can simply mean showing that you've treated, I mean, that's fairness at its absolute heart. But it has two distinct meanings in this context. Um, Lawyers, when you say bias, they think of a case called Porter v. McGill, which happened back again in the 1990s, involving the Dame Shirley Porter, then the leader of Westminster Council, doing some awfully dodgy things with property in Westminster. And they came out with this test for what something's biased is whether a fair-minded observer with access to all of the facts would conclude there was a real possibility of bias. Now, the Secretary of State for Housing and Communities last year had to admit that there was a possibility of bias in some of the ways he dealt with some planning applications. It's a test that has stood the test of time and would be applied to any data issues as well. But obviously, in the data world, there's another bias issue, which is algorithmic bias. And I think we're probably actually more familiar with that as a community. The idea that if you have a badly trained algorithm on poor data sets that haven't been properly thought through, then what you have is a very powerful system that is automating bias, that is replicating bias, that is embedding and even magnifying bias. And this is where to systems that are based on AI, particularly biometrics and things like voice recognition software, need to be carefully considered in the data ethics context. Next slide, please. Transparency and accountability. These, again, are things that come up in every ethical context and pretty much every paper on digital ethics as well. And the question is, well, how do I show that I'm being transparent and accountable? Well, if you're a charity, you're probably more than halfway there. You'll have regular meetings. Decisions you make at those meetings will be documented and recorded, and that is transparency. If you're not already there, then these are my kind of quite simple guidelines for showing that you're being transparent and accountable. Firstly, you make decisions in a consistent way. You have your meetings at a regular time, at a regular place, whether that's online or not. You have a list of the people who made the decision. You record the decision. And the next one isn't required by law, but it's terribly good practice, which is to say not only why you made that decision, but not only how you made that decision, but why, the reasons for it. And then when you've made that decision and you've issued your reasons, make that available to everybody. Be as public as you can about it. We all know that there's some shenanigans going on in Downing Street at the moment, and a lot of that is to do with decisions that were not made publicly, that were not made consistently, and were not made in a way that was open to the public, or had reasons that were good and ethical. And I'm sure somebody at some point will mention the Nolan principles as well. And you don't want to replicate that kind of bad reputation at a lower level, particularly not when you're working with a local authority or a public sector organisation. Next slide, please. Ethics in practice. This is my final point as a sort of practical side, and this is where I think data is different to other ethical concepts. If I was reviewing a planning decision for its ethical reasonableness and compliance, it would be something I would probably only need to do once, because the decision would be taken once for something that will be built once as a static entity. Data is not static. It's dynamic, it's powerful, it's energetic, and society is not static either. Um, Things that were ethical thrive 3 or even 1 year ago are now seen as questionable. I know that some of my colleagues and certainly people in local government can find that difficult, because it's that, people talk about a minefield. I like it. I like that we constantly have to think nowadays about whether something is ethical, whether you need to revisit something that you enjoyed a year ago or something that you would have said a year ago. I really like that. But for data ethics, it means that you're constantly thinking, is this still ethical? Not just, is it ethical once in time? So if you've got those standards, if you've got those decisions, I think it's really good practice to revisit them regularly, review them, shake them up, think, are they still working? I think this is the fourth foundation for me of really good ethical practice in data. Next slide, please. And this is another, I've harnessed this one from somewhere else. This is from one of the papers produced by the London Office of Technology and Innovation. I think it's an excellent way of how you work with data, that you keep this circularity. And I think it works really well with data ethics too, to keep thinking about where you're going, where you've come from, and constantly review whether you're up to speed or not.